Lesson 17. The 10 Plagues. Let my people go. Reading Exodus 5. Objective. This lesson teaches us the supremacy of Yahweh against the gods of the Egyptians. God is more powerful than Pharaoh and the Egyptians and could deliver his people, that his purpose with the nation of Israel might be fulfilled. Background. Moses had spent 40 years in the wilderness, and God had now sent him back to Pharaoh's court to demand Israel's release that they might journey to the land of promise. Pharaoh was the unchallenged ruler of Egypt, and he displayed the worst of fleshly characteristics, pride and arrogance. It was to this man that Moses and Aaron went to plead for Israel's release. Pharaoh rejects Moses' request. Exodus 5. Moses and Aaron visited the court of Pharaoh and made Yahweh's request known. Let my people go, in verse 1. The response from Pharaoh was not the same as it had been from Israel. Pharaoh worshipped his own gods, and his response was to challenge the existence of the God of Israel. Who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice? I know not Yahweh. Verse 2. It was upon this challenge that Yahweh determined to show Pharaoh and the entire world that he was the only true God, the supreme ruler of the universe. Pharaoh was such a hard man that he decided to make the burden of slavery even heavier upon the Hebrew laborers. Verse 6 to 8. Here was a test of faith for Israel, for the presence of Moses had initially made their situation worse, not better. And even Moses himself found it hard to understand why God had allowed this to happen. Verses 20 to 23. Neither was Pharaoh impressed by the power of sign, for the same sign that had demonstrated the power and authority of Yahweh to Israel was imitated by the magicians of Israel through their trickery. Exodus 7 verse 11 to 12. Pharaoh's heart was hardened and the request for Israel's release was rejected. It was then that Yahweh directed Moses to commence the 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt. The purpose of God was sure, and Pharaoh had challenged his power. Trusting in his own might and the power of his own gods, the purpose of the plagues would be to show that the gods of Egypt were nothing, and to demonstrate that Yahweh alone is the one true God. Exodus 9 verse 14 to 17. Against all the gods of Egypt would God bring judgment. Exodus 12 verse 12. The plagues. The plagues were designed to challenge the gods of Egypt, and thereby Yahweh would prove that he was God alone. First plague, water to blood. Exodus 7 verse 14 to 25. The river Nile was worshipped as a god. Its fresh, clean waters were the lifeline of Egypt. Egypt receives virtually no rain, so they were absolutely dependent for their rich agricultural harvest on the waters of the Nile and the fertility it brought during the annual flood. As a result of this plague, all the waters in Egypt, the whole river system, lakes, dams and ponds, even water stored in vessels, was turned into blood. Verse 19. The Egyptians again copied this plague, so Pharaoh was not moved and hardened his heart. Verse 22. Second plague, frogs. Exodus 8 verse 1 to 15. The land was then covered with frogs. They were everywhere. Although the magicians tried to copy this plague, It was obvious to Pharaoh that they did not have the same ability, and now he pleaded that the frogs be removed and agreed to let Israel go. Verse 8. However, after the frogs were dead and gathered in heaps, Pharaoh again hardened his heart. Verse 15. The reaction of Pharaoh is understood if we listen to the words of Isaiah. Let favor be showed to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. Isaiah 26, verse 10. Third plague, lice. Exodus 8, verse 16 to 19. Up until now, the Egyptians of Egypt had been able to imitate the miracles performed by Moses, but now they could find no trick to bring forth lice. Verse 18. They themselves were covered with lice, as was every other living creature in Egypt. Now they had to acknowledge the power of God. This is the finger of God, they said. Verse 19. Yet Pharaoh hardened his heart. The fourth plague, flies. Exodus 8, verse 20 to 32. With this plague, a difference was now drawn between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Israelites had experienced the first 3 plagues, that they might also be impressed with the great power of God. God was now to show that Israel were his people, and that his purpose was to be seen in them. Verse 22 to 23. Flies invaded and ruined the land of Egypt. With this plague we have the first indication that Pharaoh would accept the demand to release Israel. He now offered that Israel could sacrifice to their God, but only in Egypt. Verse 25. This was not acceptable to Moses, so Pharaoh agreed to let them go a little way into the wilderness, but not very far. Verse 28. However, once again, as soon as the plague ceased, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Verse 32. Fifth plague, murrain. Exodus 9, verse 1 to 7. A disease spread through all the animals of Egypt. Cattle, horses, asses, camels, and sheep were destroyed. Verse 3. Pharaoh was furious when he found out that again Israel had been spared, but his stubborn pride refused to let them go. Verse 7. The sixth plague, boils. Exodus 9, verse 8 to 12. This painful affliction came on man and beast. The word blains in verse 9 and 10 has the idea of an inflamed eruption. The word means to belch forth. Yet for all this suffering, Pharaoh refused to let Israel go. The seventh plague, hail and fire. Exodus 9, verse 19 to 35. Pharaoh was given warning of this impending disaster so that those in Egypt who had learnt to respect the all-powerful God of Israel were spared. Verse 19 to 20. The enormity of the storm brought Pharaoh to his senses, and he pleaded for mercy and acknowledged the righteousness of God. Verse 27 to 28. Again, however, he hardened his heart. Verse 33 to 34. The eighth plague, locusts. Exodus 10, verse 3 to 20. By now the entire land of Egypt had been devastated, so that even the servants of Pharaoh pleaded with him to act reasonably. Verse 7. The truth was obvious, and Pharaoh was angry, so now he proposed a further compromise, to let the men only go and serve God. Verse 11. This was unacceptable, so the locusts came. Any vegetation that survived the hail was now to be ravaged by armies of locusts that marched through the land. Verse 15. While Pharaoh repented for a moment again, he refused to release Israel. Verse 20. The ninth plague, darkness. Exodus 10, verse 21 to 29. It was so dark that it could be felt. Again Pharaoh tried to bargain with Moses, that all the people could go, but without flocks and herds. Verse 24. Compromise with God's requirements is unacceptable. So in the end, Pharaoh threw him out of his court with the proud words, "See my face no more, for in the day thou seest my face, thou shalt die." Verse 28. With these words, Pharaoh not only challenged Moses, but the power of Yahweh that Moses represented. The last plague, number 10. The firstborn is killed. Exodus 11 and 12. This last plague would compel Pharaoh to obey Moses in chapter 11, verse 1. Pharaoh had been warned of this plague by Moses at the beginning in chapter 4, verse 22 to 23. Having repeatedly hardened his heart and refused to release God's firstborn meant that he now was to suffer this terrible loss. Every Egyptian family would feel the hand of death as the firstborn died on that night. In chapter 11, verse 5. Only those with the blood on their lintels and doorposts would be spared from God's judgment. When he seeth the blood on the lintel and on the two side posts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not suffer the destroyer to come in. Chapter 12, verse 23. At midnight the angel came and left behind a trail of destruction that not even Pharaoh could cope with. Verse 29 to 33. They now pleaded with Israel to go, all of them, old and young, their flocks and herds. None of those things mattered now, as Egypt suffered under this loss. Pharaoh was a man who was proud and stubborn. Yahweh had set him on the throne of Egypt so that his glory might be displayed for the world to see. Exodus 9 verse 16 and Romans 9 verse 17. The pride of Egypt had been crushed as God's judgments had been completed against all the gods of Egypt. During the years that followed, the plagues on Egypt were remembered as proof of the power of Yahweh. Principle for living. Humble ourselves before God. We have now seen how that Pharaoh challenged the power of Yahweh. His heart was hardened. How long wilt thou refuse to humble thyself before me? Was the question that God asked of Pharaoh. Exodus 10 verse 3. Humble, to abase self, to submit. Harden, to be tough, severe, cruel, stupid. God dwells with those of a humble spirit. Isaiah 57 verse 15. The day is coming when all the kingdoms of the world will be forced to submit to the rule of Christ. The loftiness of a man shall be bowed down, the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and Yahweh alone shall be exalted in that day. Isaiah 2 verse 17. It is now our opportunity to submit ourselves to the mighty hand of God. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. James 4 verse 7. Summary. Moses and Aaron were sent by God to Pharaoh with a message from Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, to let my people go. Pharaoh arrogantly refused, challenging Yahweh to prove his power and authority. 10 dreadful plagues were sent to show the power of Yahweh above the gods of Egypt. Finally, shattered by the slaying of the firstborn, Pharaoh thrust the Hebrews out. These lessons are the words taken from the Christadelphian Sunday School Association notes. www.cssa.asn.au Used with permission. Please email the address on the screen if you would like a copy of their books. Email your questions to readthebible2@gmail.com, and we look forward to you listening to the next lesson, which will be called the Passover. These lessons are the words taken from the Christadelphian Sunday School Association notes, www.cssa.asn.au, used with permission. Email your questions to readthebible2@gmail.com, and we look forward to you listening to the next lesson, which will be called the Passover.